In this final phase of the project, so much of our success or failure is going to depend upon the color values that we choose. So, thinking about finishing, I want to separate it into a couple different ideas, and we can examine them each and talk about how they interact. There are the colors and values that we choose to apply to the planes that we're designing, and there's the technical manipulation of that paint with our facility and our brush handling. I like to think of these a little bit separately because they are often kind of combined together, or even worse, confused for one another. To create a soft transition is not only to have a good facility with your brush and have an ability to manipulate the paint in a beautiful way, it's also to understand that each phase of that turning form, especially when it comes to flesh tones, is its own unique color value, and that the facility that we have with our paintbrush is really just to find the kind of marriage in between those individualized color values. So we want to focus a lot of our attention, certainly on color, but when we think about color, of course, we have to think about what's actually doing a lot of the work is actually the value that that color is assigned to. So finishing then is really not creating a world of greater complexity. It's just refining and creating a little bit more subtlety within the broad and clear simplicity that we established in the first two phases of this project. Now, technically what we have to do first before we really get into the actual painting itself is to check that our painting is ready to be worked on. We want a perfectly dry paint film because at this moment of the project, what we have is a painting that is sunken in. This is a perfectly natural part of the oil painting process in which the top layer of paint and the oil contained within that layer has been rendered a little bit matte because the oil within that layer has sunken in to a lower layer of the substrate. In order to kind of refresh the color and the value in the painting, we need then to reconstitute the oil in that top layer. So this then leads us to needing to oil out. In order to spread a little bit of linseed oil over the surface of the painting, we first need to understand that that layer is totally dry so that we're not picking up those pigments and spreading them around across the surface. In order to kind of dive back into the painting or get back to a place where the paint film overall, over the entire head, is all wet. In order to do this, I'm actually using a rather small, flat synthetic bristle brush. For me, it replicates a little bit the kind of design sense that I'm able to get when using a mechanical pencil or also a very sharpened regular wood pencil. I wouldn't define it so much as a line drawing as much as that I would define it as identifying the edges of the masses of value and using a line to indicate them. I know it sounds like a very subtle distinction to make, but we should understand that at this moment, for the most part, we're making a painting that is about masses of value rather than about lines. In my work, I tend to try as much as possible to use these in a kind of synthesis where line and value are kind of coexisting, but that should be understood to be a ratio, and that ratio is heavily weighted towards the meetings of masses of values rather than a painting that is over-encumbered by a sense of line. Always in our paintings, we're trying to maintain that sense of structure that is so elusive. Areas that are being painted can sometimes become so soft and nebulous that they lose that sense of believable, hard, three-dimensional form. And this is another benefit of kind of blocking in this way, is that we get to kind of re-establish those clear straight lines and angle breaks that we associate with such a good, strong block in. And as our painting diverges and gets further and further away from the actual timeline that the block-in existed, we can take this opportunity to kind of reconstitute that theme or that spirit inside the work. Your assignment at this moment of the painting is to, with your brush or with your palette knife, mix up a pile of the color value that you use to represent the shadows in your painting. Take a brush, either a synthetic round or a synthetic flat like the one that I'm using, and go through and retrace the steps of your design. Elaborate on the shapes that you made in the hair. Clarify shapes that may have gotten too soft. Basically, take a moment out of the painting and return to the expression of that first moment where structure and simplicity were the basis of the operation. just to the right and below the mouth, we can see a very cool gray temperature emerging from that area that, when contrasted against the rosy, punchy, chromatic sense of the color values on the light plane of the cheek, there is of course a very apparent difference in between those. That difference represents our color context, and every other color value that we find in this painting is more or less going to fit somewhere in between those two extreme ends of that range. We're also now deciding on the brushstrokes that we love and which ones cannot remain if we are to attain the flow of light. In brief, I'll explain the flow of light is defined by how the light touches the form. This concept is quite closely related to the lighting situation in which I always work in my tutorial videos. A primary dominant light source hits the form. As those planes turn away from that light source, they diminish in value until we come to a rather coherent and clear shadow edge. Thus, every plane touched by that light source should in some way be connected by the opacity of the paint applied to it. Very often, light shape values as well will contain a kind of softer interrelationship. And so, as we run our eye from the highest high key value on the forehead, down the glabella, down the side plane of the nose, across the cheek, and down to the upper edge of the mouth, we should find very few hard edges emanating from these areas. In that way, we speak to the way that the light shape and the values within the light shape are somewhat cohesive, connected by an almost surface tension that communicates that sense of brightness and direction in relationship to the light source. At the conclusion of any project, it's natural to reflect on what went on. It's a time to make small changes and perhaps work a little bit more slowly. In fact, sometimes you can spend as much time looking and assessing and asking questions as you do actually right up at your canvas, making concrete changes to what you've already done. The way that we work is so oriented towards starting in the broadest expression and moving towards a more specific expression, precisely for the reason that at the end of the painting, we don't want to be making major changes. This very much relates to the quote by Sir Joshua Reynolds, in which he states the best advice for art students in painting portraits would be to block in the head in such a way that you do not have to change it later. While I feel like he must have known that he was making a bit of a gaffe in the sense that every student, of course, wants to block in their head that way, I feel like he was also transmitting a kind of wisdom in that if our process works well from the broad to the specific, we actually should be able to be in a place where we don't have to make major changes throughout the course of a painting. Only incremental ones that take us closer and closer to the truth. When you assess your process in this final stage, it should also reveal to you how complete your understanding is, both of the subject that you're painting, but also the process that you use to paint it. With that in mind, let's utilize the final stages of our painting in precisely the way that they're meant to be used. Search for very subtle transitions that you can make in small areas, around the outside corner of the eye, around the outside corner of the mouth. Make sure that the highlights tend to either stand out or blend into the planes around them in just such a way that they're indicated in the source photography, or for that matter, on the surface of the live model that you're working from. This is the moment where our painting is set up to make a conclusion that is eventually very subtle and very meaningful. My assignment for you in this moment, in this final expression of the project, is to assess your work in comparison to a work that you admire. Take a reproduction of a Sargent painting, or a Bouguereau painting, or a painting by Bastien Lepage. Put it next to your painting and assess in a concrete way, in a practical way, how does my handling of value, for instance, differ from the way that that artist is handling the value? What about my paint application? Is there something that that artist is doing that I want to be doing in my own work, but I'm not yet? How can I take this moment to best approach the qualities in those master paintings that I admire the most? Also, search for the lessons that you can see and the clues to actionable factors you can change and improve. So much of painting is wrapped up in a very emotional process. Creativity, in fact, is so much ingrained in us that it becomes difficult to separate ourselves from the work that we're making. And so we tend to look at the conclusion of a painting and say, I'm just not good enough. What I think is preferable for a student is to say, rather, how can I improve that? So remember, as you assess your painting in this final moment, look for actionable factors, things that you can improve and change. Every painting that you make should be a step on that process to attaining the sense of beauty and subtlety that you see in work that you really appreciate.